Greetings and welcome, colleagues. This presentation is titled Fostering a Cultural Wealth Framework for Teaching and Learning in the Online Classroom. My name is Dr. Lisa William, and I have served in the field of education for 30 years now. I'm a professor of English and Education at Delta College and a professor of education in the Graduate and Professional Studies Department at Sacramento State University. Offered here are a few additional points about my background. I earned my PhD from the School of Education with an emphasis in language, literacy, and culture from the University of California, Davis, as well as a secondary teaching credential with a focus in English language arts. I earned a Master of Arts in Education with an emphasis in teaching English as a second language from the University of San Francisco. And I also earned two bachelor's degrees, one in English and the other in journalism with an emphasis in public relations from Humboldt State University. I've authored and have co authored over 20 academic journals, articles, book chapters, and other publications. So, my writing, research, social, and civic engagement are situated in the areas of educational equity, race and gender in education, social justice education, and curriculum studies. This presentation represents a small portion of research and activity undertaken during my sabbatical during spring 2024. Firstly, and right out of the gate, this presentation is grounded in an equity and social justice agenda. Here, I propose strategies for effective and inclusive instructional design, drawing on culturally responsive teaching for online spaces. The ideas presented aim to foster student centered online spaces and reimagine possibilities for student engagement, representation, expression, and action. Further, this presentation integrates the Learning for Justice anti bias framework, social justice standards, which I'll speak about a bit later. So, here I offer my objectives for this presentation. I will introduce the purpose of this work, share socio-political insights from scholarship, provide background on universal design for learning or e-learning, provide a brief introduction of the social justice standards for teaching, and offer instructional ideas for online teaching that are culturally responsive. So I begin here with my introduction and purpose. I intend to provide content within context. Thus, I will share several quotes that I wish for you to consider as we explore the issues within this presentation. The ideologies front loaded here will allow us to delve into the socio political context that shapes the educational landscape. So let's examine a few quotes. Education policies and practices can reduce or reinforce educational inequalities stemming from student starting points and ongoing circumstances. There is no one size fits all policy guaranteed to produce the best results. Our systems cripple many students because they were designed so that students who have been historically marginalized cannot be successful. A socially just approach to education is rooted in the core belief that all educators, despite their role and or title, must do more than what has been prescribed to the students and families that they serve. Our schools reflect the sociocultural and sociopolitical context in which we live. This context is unfair to many young people and their families and the situations in which they live and go to school. But teachers and other educators do not simply have to go along with this reality. I believe one of our primary rules as educators is to interrupt the cycle of inequality and oppression. We can do this best by teaching well with heart and soul. The manner in which educators ensure that students' culture, lived experiences, identities, and values are the driver for classroom instructional planning is non negotiable. We must demonstrate through our conscientious choices that our students matter. This is explained in the work of Dr. Bettina Love, where she heralds what mattering means to educators who uphold a radical love for their students and work as change agents within their classroom space. Dr. Love elucidates the following. The practice of abolitionist teaching is rooted in the internal desire we all have for freedom, joy, restorative justice, restoring humanity, not just rules, and to matter to ourselves, our community, our family, and in our country with the profound understanding that we must demand the impossible by refusing injustice and the disposability of dark children. Demanding the impossible means we understand that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, classism, mass incarceration, and U.S. immigration and customs enforcement are protected systems that will not be dismantled because we ask. They will be dismantled because we fight. Now, these quotes represent a small sampling of ideologies articulated by progressive and critical scholars and educators who are championing efforts to re envision and transform classroom pedagogy and andragogy. From this standpoint, an educator who is committed to equity and social justice use the classroom space to demonstrate that their students matter, along with centering the issues that students deem as important. We aim to educate the whole person and to be culturally responsive. So, what is meant by the term culturally responsive teaching? Culturally responsive teaching is a research based approach to teaching. It connects students' cultures, languages, and life experiences with what they learn in school. These connections help students access rigorous curriculum and develop higher level academic skills. At this moment in time, I will offer some socio-political insights from scholarship. Here, I will revisit an often cited yet nebulously executed term in our educational settings. Let us examine the concept of equity. Equity means ensuring high outcomes and removing barriers that thwart student success, reflecting on and disrupting inequitable practices stemming from biases, while seeking to create diverse and inclusive learning spaces. Equity suggests that there are principles that animate and direct educators' efforts when working with students. The principle of equity acknowledges that students experience schooling in different and often unfair ways at the classroom level. It acknowledges that the conditions needed to optimize learning are inherently unfair and biased. Now, it comes as little surprise to many when we say that inequalities exist within schools and society. Educational outcomes for students differ based on social, cultural, economic, and political factors that shape the educational landscape. For instance, it is well documented that social and economic disadvantages, as well as a plethora of associated conditions, depress academic performance for Black, Brown, and poor children. To further illustrate this point, Rothstein's article, The Racial Achievement Gap, Segregated Schools and Segregated Neighborhoods, a Constitutional Insult, explains that educational outcomes have been shaped by policy decisions stemming from a history of racialization, segregation, and xenophobia. He posits that multi generational segregated poverty characterizes the experiences of many Black and Brown children, which serve as additional barriers to school achievement. Such conditions contribute to factors such as chronic absenteeism, less complex academic language skills, underdeveloped organizational skills, less access to disposable income, all of which are important aids to support academic achievement. Further, a combination of structural, physical, social, and affective forces correlate with the quality of students' learning experiences. When we look more closely at school environments and student achievement, it is noted that poor learning outcomes are a manifestation of both macro level issues, such as a history of residential housing discrimination, segregation, and under resourced and underfunded schools, which has micro level effects. Moreover, Dr. Gloria Latson Billings reminds us that there is an education debt based on historic, economic, socio-political, and moral factors in our nation. The education debt is the foregone schooling resources that we could have and should have been investing in primarily low income kids, which deficit leads to a variety of social problems: crime, low productivity, low wages, low labor force participation, that require ongoing public investment. This required investment sucks away resources that could go to reducing the achievement gap. Without the education debt, we could narrow the achievement gap. Now, despite the data and the research that has documented the educational debt, as well as our country's history of social and economic inequality, there still persists in our society a wide range of deficit views related to students of color, linguistic minority students, the poor, etc. Yet I appreciate the reframing and examinations that are offered through a critical race theory perspective, particularly the work of Dr. Tara Yoso in the article Whose Culture Has Capital, a critical race theory discussion of community cultural wealth. In this particular article, she focuses on how an array of cultural knowledge, skills, abilities, and contexts possessed by socially marginalized groups often go unrecognized and unacknowledged in school, and that young people from communities of color in particularly possess varied forms of cultural capital that's nurtured as a part of their lived experiences. And the cultural wealth includes such things as aspirational capital, navigational capital, social, linguistic, familial, and resistance capital. And these forms of capital are forms of knowledge that students bring with them from their homes and communities into classrooms. And it's these strengths, this multiplicity of strengths that comes from communities of color that teachers need to learn to leverage in order to move towards more just and democratic teaching. Said differently, these forms of capital are central to the construction of students' cultures and identities. So, knowing these things, where do we go from here? So, here I will briefly introduce the Universal Design for Learning or e learning framework. The Universal Design for e-learning framework involves designing online educational materials and environments that are accessible and usable by a diverse range of learners, including those with various abilities, backgrounds, and learning styles. The UDeL guidelines or frameworks are tools used in the implementation of Universal Design for Learning. The guidelines offer a set of concrete suggestions that can be applied to any discipline or domain to ensure that all learners can access and participate in meaningful, challenging learning opportunities. This means that content is presented in various formats, learners have different ways to engage with the material, and they can demonstrate their understanding through various means. This inclusivity helps cater to diverse learning styles, preferences, and abilities, ensuring that all students, regardless of their background, have an equal opportunity to succeed. UDL is a framework that reminds us why we teach. It is greater than content, it is greater than test scores. We teach because it is a calling to improve our cities and our world by believing the best about the students we serve. UDL acknowledges the areas that need to be addressed, but through the lens of student strengths and natural abilities and interests. First, learners are quite diverse in the ways in which they are engaged or motivated to learn, and we all know this from our experiences. There are a variety of factors that can influence individual variation in affect, including neurology, culture, personal relevance in terms of the material, subjectivity, and background knowledge, along with a host of other factors. And some learners are highly engaged and willing to get into that material, and others are completely disengaged or disinterested or even afraid. So it really depends on the learner and the context. And this context enables us to then think about who are our learners and what are their needs. The next guideline is representation. So, we as educators must provide multiple means of representation for our students. Of course, learners differ in the ways that they perceive and comprehend information that is presented to them. We have students, of course, with sensory disabilities, at times those who might be blind or deaf, learning disabilities such as dyslexia. We certainly have many students who are bilingual, biliterate, and so we have language differences, we have cultural differences, and many other aspects and subjectivities in the learning context that may require different ways of approaching content. And of course, curriculum content is never neutral. Now, that's a broader discussion that gets into curriculum theory, and I'm not going there here. But it is important to understand that some students grasp information more quickly and efficiently through some forms and means of content, for example, through visual and auditory materials or text. Also, learning and the transfer of learning occurs when there are multiple representations that are used in order to build schema and make schema based connections within and between concepts that are being taught. So, in short, there's not one way or one means of representation that will be optimal for all learners. So, providing options is essential. The next UDeL guideline deals with providing multiple means of action and expression. Now, of course, learners differ in the ways that they can navigate the learning context, our classrooms, our environments, and they express what they know differently based on their unique talents and strengths. For example, individuals with significant movement impairments will struggle with certain types of strategic or organizational abilities. Students have different levels of executive function and their ability to demonstrate what they know. We have students who have different language strengths and barriers, different levels of proficiency, and so forth. And so it demands that we provide opportunities for varied approaches to learning tasks. Some students may be able to express themselves well in written text, but not orally, and vice versa. So, for us as educators, it should also be important for us to recognize that action and expression require a great deal of strategy, variety, practice, and organization so that we can help cultivate our learners' differences. This includes empowering students to use their own language in classroom lessons and learning activities, which is one of the most essential elements of the student's identity and forms of expression. When we think through a UDL lens, we think about the context that we are teaching in and what we know about the learners with whom we are working with. We think about our objective. What is it that we are here to do? What are we trying to attain? What is the learning goal and outcome that we seek to fulfill? We identify potential barriers to learning and well being for students. So we think about those areas that might provide cognitive or affective blocks for our students. We also try to identify what types of resources would provide universal supports for all learning. So, how are we going to scaffold and make sure that we are providing students the resources that are necessary? We use UDL guidelines to design learning for our students so that we are able to teach, evaluate, revise, rethink what we do. And so it's a recursive process. Now, the Center for Applied Special Technology, or CAST, leads a global community of educators in creating inclusive learning experiences through universal design for learning. Let's take a look at some of their ideas in the video presented here.
This teacher needs to meet a curriculum goal, and she's got a very diverse group of students. And so does this teacher. And this one. Most do. In fact, research shows that the way people learn is as unique as their fingerprints. What does this mean for teachers of today? Classrooms are highly diverse, and curriculum needs to be designed from the start to meet this diversity. Universal design for learning is an approach to curriculum that minimizes barriers and maximizes learning for all students. Whoa, that's a fancy term. Universal design for learning. Let's unpack it a bit. Let's think about the word universal. By universal, we mean curriculum that can be used and understood by everyone. Each learner in the classroom brings her own background, strengths, needs, and interests. Curriculum should provide genuine learning opportunities for each and every student. Now let's think about the word learning. Learning is not one thing. Neuroscience tells us that our brains have three broad networks. One for recognition, the what of learning, one for skills and strategies, the how of learning, and one for caring and prioritizing, the why of learning. Students need to gain knowledge, skills, and enthusiasm for learning, and a curriculum needs to help them do all three. But every learner is unique, and one size does not fit all. So how do we make a curriculum that challenges and engages diverse learners? This is where the word design comes in. A universally designed building is planned to be flexible and to accommodate all kinds of users, with and without disabilities. It turns out that if you design for those in the margins, your building works better for everyone. Curb cuts and ramps are used by people in wheelchairs, people with strollers, and people on bikes. Captioning on TV serves people who are deaf, people learning English, people in gyms, and spouses who get to sleep at different times. UDeL takes this idea and applies it to the design of flexible curriculum. UDeL goes beyond access because we need to build in support and challenge. So how do we use the UDeL framework to make learning goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone? First, ask yourself, what is my goal? What do I want my students to know, do, and care about? Then ask, what barriers in the classroom might interfere with my diverse students reaching these goals? To eliminate the barriers, use the 3 UDeL principles to create flexible paths to learning so that each student can progress. Number 1, provide multiple means of representation. Present content and information in multiple media and provide varied supports. Use graphics and animation, highlight the critical features, activate background knowledge, and support vocabulary so that students can acquire the knowledge being taught. Number 2, provide multiple means of action and expression. Give students plenty of options for expressing what they know and provide models, feedback, and supports for their different levels of proficiency. Number 3, provide multiple means of engagement. What fires up one student won't fire up another. Give students choices to fuel their interests and autonomy. Help them risk mistakes and learn from them. If they love learning, they will persist through challenges. And remember, always keep in mind the learning goal. Get rid of barriers caused by the curriculum and keep the challenge where it belongs. And that's it. Okay, quick recap. Show the information in different ways, allow your students to approach learning tasks and demonstrate what they know in different ways, and offer options that engage students and keep their interest. Universal design for learning equals learning opportunities for all.
Now, that particular video provides some great insights, but I wish to layer on a bit further. The scholarship in the text Equity by Design by Chardon and Kovac, published in 2021, also offers some preliminary questions for educators to answer related to their teaching in the classroom context, known as conducting an equity audit, so preparing the conditions to work with diverse learners. So, an equity audit is a study of the fairness of an institution's policies, programs, and practices. And an audit represents a significant investment in resources in terms of human capital and materials. At the classroom level, equity audits are systemic examinations of data, curriculum, and materials to understand where gaps to access and challenges to educational equity exist. So, equity audit questions to ask at the classroom level are as follows: who gets to be involved in curriculum development to meet standards? Are all students held to the same standards? Are the policy and instructional modifications put in place when students are unable to meet the standards? Does the curriculum utilize print and non print materials that represent diverse groups? Do recommended textbooks and other instructional materials reflect, as much as possible, the experiences and perspectives of diversity among racial, ethnic, language, religious, and gender groups? Are classroom activities and examples multicultural according to race, ethnicity, language, gender, and disability? Does the teacher use classroom lessons to increase awareness and counter effects of bias and discrimination? Do the curriculum infuse culturally responsive information into instructional approaches and prepare students for a diverse society and workplace? Are people with disabilities shown in the curriculum actively interacting with people both with and without disabilities? Is language used that does not stereotype people or groups? All right, all of this sounds simple enough, right? Well, not just yet. If we also begin to think about social justice teaching standards, then the concepts of engagement, representation, action, and expression are far more nuanced. So, what are these social justice teaching standards? Well, let's take a look. These social justice standards are a set of anchor standards and age appropriate learning outcomes divided into four domains: identity, diversity, justice, and action. The standards provide a common language and organizational structure. Teachers can use them to guide curriculum development, and administrators can use them to make schools more just, equitable, and safe. According to Learning for Justice, teaching about identity, diversity, justice, and action allows educators to engage with a range of anti bias, multicultural, and social justice issues. This continuum of engagement is unique among social justice teaching material, which tend to focus on one or two areas, either reducing prejudice or advocating collective action. Prejudice reduction seeks to minimize conflict and generally focusing on changing the attitudes and behaviors of a dominant group. Collective action challenges inequality directly by raising consciousness and focusing on improving conditions for underrepresented groups. The standards recognize that in today's diverse classrooms, students need knowledge and skills related to both prejudice reduction and collective action. Classrooms that promote students as the starting point and that maintain a focus on the student as the subject of all learning is an educational imperative. This includes empowering students to be agents in their own learning while encouraging critical thinking and critical consciousness. And critical consciousness forms the bedrock of social justice teaching. So let me speak about this for just a moment. Critical consciousness is a social concept in education developed by Brazilian pedagogical theorist and educator Paulo Freire. It's also known as socio-political consciousness and is the ability to reflect and act on one's socio-political environment. It's often viewed as a process in which marginalized and oppressed populations recognize and analyze systems of inequality and the commitment to take action against these systems. Many critical and progressive educators believe that developing critical consciousness can be a gateway to academic motivation and achievement for marginalized students. Freire believed the classroom to be a place where social change could take place. To achieve such, he believed that each student should play an active role in their own learning, as opposed to being the passive recipient of knowledge. Students must be encouraged to think, reflect, evaluate, and act as agents of change for themselves as well as for the betterment of society. When we as teachers also position ourselves as learners in our own classroom, we are more attuned to the issues that matter to our students. From this standpoint, we recognize then that our students' lived experiences, voices, and perspectives have value. We realize the power that they possess and trust in their abilities to bring about consciousness and social change. According to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Members of Gen Z, for example, tend to be more liberal leaning, tech savvy, and represent one of the most racially diverse and well educated generations on record. And this is substantiated by research by the Pew Research Center. Gen Zers have been able to connect to cultures around the world and learn about issues and news earlier and more often than any generation before them. So, this broad cultural exposure from an early age likely contributes to their tendency to be more open minded, more liberal, and to advocate for fair and equal treatment for others. Members of Gen Z are passionate about being advocates for social change. About 70% of Gen Zers believe that the government should be more active in addressing social problems and global issues. Gen Zers are also comfortable driving change. They use platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, now known as X, and TikTok. These youth have helped to move activism into the digital age. Now, in this part of the presentation, I offer some instructional ideas to support engagement, representation, action, and expression. Keep in mind that UDEL is all about differentiated instruction. Differentiated instruction, also known as differentiation, is a teaching philosophy aimed at accommodating the diverse needs of students within a classroom. This approach provides various methods for understanding new information, which includes acquiring content, processing ideas, and creating teaching materials and assessments. So, by utilizing different tools, content, and processes, differentiated instruction ensures that all students can learn effectively regardless of their abilities. We must aim to design materials that cater to different learning styles, ensuring our students have a well rounded learning experience. The beauty of multimodal learning lies in its ability to engage multiple sensory systems simultaneously, and this provides a more comprehensive and effective educational journey for our students. There are four types of multimodal learning, often referred to as the VARK learning model: visual, oral, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. First, I will speak about visual literacy development. Today's students increasingly inundated with a steady stream of imagery from multimedia platforms, including the internet, social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, television and film, and advertisements, are global consumers of media in their everyday lives. Yet, they often lack the skills necessary to move beyond passive receivers of visual media messages. Visual images such as photographs, illustrations, pictures, diagrams, and maps, which are combined in visual statements, helps to communicate meaning, capture attention, foster curiosity, and propel viewers to read and accompanying text. So everyone needs to use and understand images in communications of all kinds, from formal professional publications to casual social media posts. Of course, our students know how to use Instagram and TikTok and things of that nature. So integrating those things in the classroom is important. And knowing the basics of visual language or visual grammar is essential for consumers of information. Moreover, classrooms can become spaces for students to effectively communicate in and contribute to analytical and global dialogue for discussions of race and diversity, multicultural life and history, thus encouraging students to become active deconstructionists of visual grammar. Visual literacy explicitly teaches a collection of competencies that will help students think through, think about, and think with pictures. We are teaching students to interpret, recognize, appreciate, and understand information presented through visual actions, objects, or symbols. We are teaching them to read images. To promote photo analysis as a skill in the classroom, I've chosen this format from the National Archives. When we analyze a photograph or meet a photo, we show students how to scan an image to determine what they notice first. Is it a portrait? Does it express an event? Do we see individuals? Is it panoramic, etc.? We observe its parts, the people, the objects, and the activities, and we ask students to summarize what they see. We try to make sense of the photograph. And so, questions to facilitate such is to ask the following: who took the photograph? Where is it from? When is it from? What was happening at the time in history this photo was taken? Why was it taken? And this evidence allows us to develop our knowledge about the photograph that leads to a conclusion. We use photographs as historical evidence, and we ask, what did you find out from this photo that you might not learn anywhere else? And what other documents, photos, or historical evidence are you going to use to help you understand this event or topic? Visual teaching strategies help students to visualize complex or abstract ideas, improve attention, increase information retention, and organize information more effectively. In fact, the brain processes visuals 60,000 times faster than text. In addition, in our efforts to promote visual literacy, we should use virtual whiteboards, encourage our students to visually demonstrate what they have learned through diagrams, graphs, concept maps, annotated visuals, etc. We should convey complex concepts with digital media, use concept maps to drive critical thinking, and share graphic organizers before, during, and after lessons. Within the UDeL framework, we aim to make content accessible to everyone. To illustrate this point, all curriculum requires some form of English literacy, and there are 6 domains: reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, and visual representation. And no matter the level of student competency, we must ensure that all students can access and utilize these domains. That said, creating supports to enhance reading and text comprehension through visual literacy is an imperative. Visual literacy builds stronger readers, readers who can think about text in numerous ways through a different lens. Visual literacy can be used to find the main idea, analyze and make inferences, and find support and evidence. Teachers must cultivate students' ability to assess content presented in various formats and media. This skill often requires both teacher guidance and independent practice. And as students become adept at interpreting different forms of media, such as art, infographics, films, videos, political cartoons, photographs, maps, advertisements, and slide presentations, they learn to use their imagination to read between the lines and draw meaningful conclusions. Visual literacy fosters student reflection, analysis, and critical thinking. In addition, teachers can enhance lessons by pairing short stories and major literary works like essays, novels, and longer texts with photographs. They can then prompt students to use evidence from informational texts to support their analysis, reflections, and research. In order to contextualize and provide support for all of you, here is a visual literacy example from one of my English composition courses. Hello, everyone. It is time to make an intertextual connection, and we are using our course text, of course, The Other Westmore, One Name, Two Fates by author Westmore. So we will be examining chapter 1, Is Daddy Coming With Us? When we make intertextual connections, we are doing several things. We connect what we are reading to our own experiences, our thoughts, maybe travel, family, friends, school. We also make text to text connections. There are times where I'll ask you to look at the core reading in the course and kind of compare and contrast that reading to another reading. So we call that text to text connections. So we'll look at other books, sometimes poetry, sometimes songs, articles, websites, blogs, YouTube videos, you name it. And then also, we are always making text to world connections. So what's going on around us in terms of television, movies, current events, games, news, pop culture, you name it. So we're doing that here. This intertextual connection begins on page 14 of our text at the bottom of the page, and it begins as follows. My father was dead 5 hours after having been released from the hospital with the simple instruction to get some sleep. The same hospital was now preparing to send his body to the morgue. My father had entered the hospital seeking help, but his face was unshaven, his clothes disheveled, his name unfamiliar, his address not in an affluent area. The hospital looked at him askance, insulted him with ridiculous questions, and basically told him to fend for himself. Now my mother had to plan his funeral. He died on a Friday night. We were told at first that the hospital wouldn't be able to determine the cause of death until Monday, when they would perform the autopsy. But my father's radio station wanted to issue a news release about his death, so it leaned on the morgue to perform the autopsy sooner. The morgue acquiesced, and by Saturday afternoon, we found out that he had died from acute epilotitis, a rare but treatable virus that causes the epilotitis to swell and cover the air passages to the lungs. Untreated because of the earlier misdiagnosis, my father's body suffocated itself. As you can see from the text excerpt, the author Wes Moore is describing an event that was significant and impactful in his life. It was traumatic. And unfortunately, one of the realities of living our lives is that we move through experiences that are challenging, sometimes traumatic, sometimes negative, sometimes emotional. And he definitely describes an event that probably ticks all of those boxes for him. Now, in making an intertextual connection, I am asking you to do some reflection. So, in 2 to 3 paragraphs, I want you to describe an incident or experience whereby you experienced a significant shift or change in your family that would forever change or shape your family in some way. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be the death of a loved one or a divorce or family members moving away. I mean, it could be something that's positive. So keep that in mind as you reflect and think about what type of connection might you be able to make. The key here is to be descriptive and helping the audience to understand the following. Who was involved? What happened? When did this happen? Where did this happen? Why or how did this happen? Important is to use descriptive detail. And as you look back on the writing of Wes Moore, you see how he uses adjectives to describe this particular event in his life. So pay attention to that as a technique for writing. And make sure once you write and post your response to go back and read and reply to your peers. So that was a very short excerpt that supported a writing activity for the online environment, but I also want to provide another type of example for a different course. This visual literacy example is for an expository text for a hip hop course. So, expository text, also known as informational text, is a nonfiction text that provides information or facts about a topic. Expository texts are often used, of course, in our educational settings for history, science, and social sciences, but they can also be found in professional settings and books that are meant to teach. Greetings and welcome, everybody. I begin this presentation with a focus on the work of journalist and historian Jeff Chang and his book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation. According to the article, The South Bronx, where hip hop was born, it states this. Hip hop's foundations were being laid in the 1970s, brick by brick, by DJs in the South Bronx, sometimes even in burnt out or deteriorating buildings. These pioneers invented sampling, isolating one sound and reusing it in another song,
and hip hop's other key elements through trial and error, mostly by fooling around with records at home. But before we get to all of that, what's up with the burnt out and deteriorating buildings? We need to look at that. That's what we will focus on here. So it is vital that I begin with this important context because it's imperative for us to understand the socio-political context of what was shaping the lives of Black and Brown youth and their families and their community within the South Bronx in the 1960s and the 1970s that helped to create this art form, this culture, this music. So I will begin with a focus on Jeff Chang's work, chapter 1, titled Necropolis, the Bronx and the Politics of Abandonment. And you will find that throughout this presentation, I will thread back and forth between different decades of what was taking place within New York City and particularly the South Bronx. So let's take a moment and think about word choice here for a moment, because as writers, we are intentional or should be intentional about the words we choose. So journalist and historian Jeff Chang chooses as his title and subtitle for chapter 1, Necropolis, the Bronx and the Politics of Abandonment. So let's deal first with this word abandonment. What comes to mind when you think about the term abandonment? So we have two definitions here. Number one, the act of abandoning something or someone. And of course, it's used in a sentence below it. I'll move on. Definition number 2, the state of being abandoned. So when we take these two definitions and we think about these in relationship to the Bronx, what might Jeff Chang be telling us as just in the title alone about the Bronx and the utilization of the word abandonment? So hang with that, okay? Because we're going to look at the politics of this issue as we move forward. Now, Chang also uses the word necropolis. So let's deal with this one. And I have a visual image here to give you all a sense of what is being spoken about. So a necropolis basically is a large design cemetery with elaborate tombs and monuments. And it's a Greek word, which literally means city of the dead. The term usually implies a separate burial site at a distance from a city, as opposed to tombs within cities, which were common in various places and periods of history. Now, while the word is most commonly used for ancient sites, the name was revived in the early 19th century and applied to planned city cemeteries. Now, think about this, the word necropolis, because of course, Jeff Chang isn't literally speaking of a cemetery when he uses this word in the title of his chapter, yet he calls the Bronx a necropolis. So we need to understand why he uses that word to signify this particular area of New York. So here I take you on a visual tour through the South Bronx in the early 1970s. So here you see an area with burnt out cars next to tenements. You also see abandoned vehicles that have been stripped down. You see children in the midst of this decay, and you see teenagers and young men sitting on the porch stoops of what looks like a brownstone. We have more visual imagery here of burnt out abandoned buildings in these tenements, or what people commonly refer to as vertical ghettos, or basically the projects. Here we have another visual, and this certainly shows urban decay, squalor, a wasteland of debris, garbage, and filth. And we see young people coexisting within this environment. And certainly it looks like they are either going to or coming from school with their books and even musical instruments. Consider this, folks. If the aesthetics of the environment looks like this, think about the infrastructure. What about the municipalities that people living in this environment have access to? Water, garbage, sewer, electricity. Give thought to how people are coexisting in this particular environment. And of course, amongst the wreck and ruin, we have the people who must live and survive within the context of this particular environment. So we have some imagery of children and teens and youth who were living in the South Bronx during this time period. We have generations of families, mothers, fathers, grandparents, babies, children, certainly, all of the aspects of family. And of course, more imagery of youth and children hanging out in their neighborhoods. And it begs the question, what types of ideologies, what types of mindsets, what types of art, what types of viewpoints and creativity emerge in one's environment when this is the environment? And again, we're going to look at that. How do people interpret and make sense of their world? How do you find joy within the context of what could be considered chaos? These are all enduring questions as we think about the art form, the culture, the lifestyle that emerged within hip hop as a cultural behemoth, but certainly within the poetics that emerged during the early 1980s that comes out of this particular experience. So I just gave you a little visual tour there, but I really want to ask the question and want you to think about, how do you feel when you see that particular imagery with children and youth and families living in the conditions that were presented to you? Now, of course, this is unacceptable anywhere in the world. And we know that many people the world over live in less than humane conditions. But this is a city within the United States of America, and it's not unique to certainly the South Bronx, because we certainly see this type of imagery in other places as well. But it begs the question, how do we get to that? What happened to produce that? These are the issues that we must unpack and explore in more detail. So when we think about that term, necropolis, when we think about the title, the politics of abandonment, we need to understand, of course, what was going on. Thus, here I begin with an important starting point for our historical understanding. All right, folks, thank you for hanging in there with me for that longer visual literacy example using expository text. So let's take a look at additional examples. I particularly like the strategy for including multimodal learning in the classroom by utilizing a one-page response. A one page is a summary document that brings together all the relevant information, themes, facts, etc. on a topic on a single page, and it is an effective form of communication. The one page response requires students to use higher level thinking while applying artistic or graphic art skills. Such visual examples enhances students' thinking and learning, promotes active engagement, facilitates synthesis and comprehension of information, and promotes critical thinking. Learning menus, or what is referred to as choice boards, are a form of differentiated learning, and it gives students a menu or choice of learning activities. They can be created in a variety of styles and mediums, and they've been around for a long time. And so there are lots of options for creating both paper versions as well as digital tools that can be used in the online classroom. Learning menus or choice boards can encompass a variety of activities, can also be adapted for a variety of different age levels and disciplines. Novak Education Consulting provides some high quality exemplars and directions for creating choice boards. You will find, if you go to the website for this particular organization, there are hyperlinked documents and articles and resources for how to create TED Talks, multimedia presentations, podcasts, newsletters, blogs, white papers, and scientific posters, all very detailed, interactive, and extensive. Now, here are a few ideas to promote critical thinking and critical consciousness. I appreciate the Learning for Justice lesson activity titled Reading Against the Grain, and it is intended to help students analyze the dominant reading of a text
and engage in alternative or resistant readings. Resistant readings scrutinize the beliefs and attitudes that typically go unexamined in a text, drawing attention to the gaps, silences, and contradictions. When we center the UDL guidelines of engagement, representation, action, and expression into our pedagogy and andragogy, we are also inviting diverse epistemologies into the classroom. Classrooms are not neutral learning environments. Rather, they are shaped by one's worldview. So, to contextualize this, a worldview is essentially the framework through which individuals interpret and make sense of the world around them. Worldviews are shaped by a multitude of factors such as culture, family upbringing, educational exposure, and personal experiences. For example, for an instructor, worldview influences the form of the selection of topics, themes, and materials included in educational curricula. Worldview is powerful in that the educational content may be tailored to align with the teacher's cultural perspectives and norms. Yet we also wish to invite, and it's imperative for us to invite students' diverse epistemologies and worldview into the classroom space. In efforts to promote critical thinking and critical consciousness, I particularly like this lesson idea from Dr. Krista Hunt, a professor of women's studies and politics. In this lesson, she empowers her students to take action on an issue that they care about. So here are some descriptive details related to this assignment. Titled, Now What? Take Action. And it states, so what issue do you care about? What can you do to address this? How can you get others involved? And it further states, here is an action project that students carry out in our courses. But really, with motivation and hard work, anyone can take action. We suggest working with others, but you can do the same action on your own. From our experience, students who work individually almost always reflect that they wish they had worked in group. Furthermore, she empowers students to identify an issue, to begin to examine the particular issue by addressing the power dynamics that are at play, who are the allies, and what are the potential obstacles or challenges involved in creating change on a particular issue. There are other prompting questions that enable students to think through a process. And she asks students to develop an action plan for meeting particular goals and addressing the needs. And finally, she provides the form of assessment that she's utilizing for this particular project. However, a modification that I would suggest is using UDEL principles and guidelines for engagement, representation, action, and expression, expanding the choice menu of what students can utilize in order to demonstrate multimodal thinking and learning. And finally, I offer a last idea here related to engaging in equitable research practices in the classroom. I appreciate the critical perspectives and the leadership that's being offered by the University of Sussex on the topic of decolonization and anti racism, particularly in the area of research practices. As a starting point, this institution challenges us to consider our reading lists. We should care about what we include, and this remains an important site of pedagogy and possibility. Whose history matters, who gets to write about the past in the present, and how that information informs the futures we imagine. They also state the dominance of scholars from the global north is pervasive in academia, and this has a direct impact on student curricula. Institutions are starting to examine data on reading lists, and it is clear that there are often significant imbalances in the diversity and representation of authors. Moreover, in efforts to expand research methods and choice within academic research, disrupting hegemonic practices and biases, this institution provides a helpful framework for decolonial research practices, asking such questions as, what is the history of my academic discipline? How are my research questions generated? Is there input from target communities? Are there any assumptions in my research questions? And what other questions could be asked? Have I considered alternative ways of learning, knowing, and doing? How will I collect my data? How will I work collaboratively and respectfully with research participants and partners, and acknowledging their contributions and co production authorship throughout the research process? And finally, how am I citing my research and my writing? Have I considered work in other languages, cultures, and mediums from non elite global North institutions? All right, colleagues, this concludes my presentation titled Fostering a Cultural Wealth Framework for Teaching and Learning in the Online Classroom. I hope you enjoyed the content contained therein, and if you should have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.